Alright, so now at this point we have the Rhino's color map that's been exported. So now let's start to focus our attention on generating the normal maps as well as the displacement maps. Alright, so here's our Rhino with the poly painting that's been applied to it. So we have the color map that's been exported, so now let's do the normal map. Now, the normal map generation in ZBrush 3 has to be done in ZBrush 3.1. Alright, ZBrush 3.0 does not have the ability to generate normal maps. So if you don't have 3.1, that's a free download if you're a 3.0 user. So you can download that and get yourself updated to 3.1. So once you install 3.1, you'll notice that you should have the Z mapper. Alright, now before we do that, we need to do a step that's similar to what we did in the previous lesson with the color map. We first need to build a new texture that is the dimensions that we want. So we'll do the same as before. We'll do 4096 by 4096, so that way we wind up with a nice big normal map at the end of this. Okay, so that way our texture is now assigned. Now for the normal maps, we want to make sure that we are at the lowest subdivision level in our geometry, so that way the normal maps get calculated from this vertex position, because this is the mesh that will actually render back in our primary 3D application. Alright, so to access the Z mapper, it can be done by simply pressing this button in the upper left hand corner of ZBrush 3.1. Alright, now I'm going to access it a little bit differently. What I'm going to do is actually press the Tab key on my keyboard to hide all the menu items. The reason being that the Z mapper needs quite a bit of real estate for its menu, and if it's being cut off, that menu won't be displayed. So in order to give that menu a little bit more room, I'll hide everything and access the Z mapper through the Z plugin menu found underneath Z mapper, and just click on that same button. So we'll give the Z mapper just a moment to load up. It'll go through, it'll analyze the geometry, and then land you in here. Right, so the first thing you'll notice is that we have this blue version of our geometry that's very slowly spinning. So let's tell it not to spin. We'll turn spinning off. We move through it the same way that we do within the normal ZBrush canvas. Alright, so within this we have a few options to control exactly how this is going to be looking. One thing that we also need to turn off is you'll notice that this object is actually changing its shape a little bit. And what it's doing is it's actually switching between the geometry that we have now, and if you recall at the very beginning of this training kit, we set a morph target. So it's showing you the changes that have happened between your geometry now and the morph target. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's turn off this morph 3D to disable that. We can also morph the UVs, so we can see what the mesh looks like compared to our UV layout, which is nice and flat. That's kind of a neat feature. We can actually see which parts of the mesh are mapped to which portions of the UV map. All right, and there's all kinds of other things we can do. We can take a look at any object space normal map, which we don't have anything yet. Tangent space normal map. The normals that are on this object, as we can see. Any sort of UV seams that are on here. Groups, textures, and so on. So we'll go ahead and switch this over to tangents. Alright, that's mainly the area that we're going to be focusing on, since we're going to be exporting a tangent space normal map. So this is where the tangents are, and a lot of times these tangents will align themselves to wherever you have any UV seams. You can see the corresponding areas where we have tangents and UV seams. They're almost identical. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is decide which application this normal map is going to be used in, because a lot of different applications read normal maps a little bit differently. So if I click on the Normal and Cavity Map tab, if I click on Open Configuration, we do have a few presets. So if you're using Max Object Space, ATI graphics cards, Maya, NVIDIA, and so on and so forth. So depending on which application you're going to be going back into, you can choose the corresponding preset. Now also you can download other types of presets from places like ZBrush Central if you don't have anything that corresponds to your particular application here. Okay, So the one I'm going to be using, since I'm going to be going back to Maya, we'll use this tangent space best. I'll open this up. Alright, and it really doesn't look like a whole lot has changed, but what it will do is, if need be, we'll go in and activate all the necessary presets for this to go back into the application of choice. So you can see one option that did get turned on was flip image vertically, because if you recall, we did have to flip the color map. Now let's also take a look. We have the expert passes, which control the different normals and how those get smoothed out. So if you look at the tangents, which we have turned on right here, you can see that we have these very definite lines between the tangents. And unfortunately, what that will probably mean for us is that we're going to be able to see a line in the normal map itself and wind up with these UV seams. So what we can do to help minimize that is if we go to the Expert Pass 2, let's start to increase how these normals will get smoothed out. So we'll post-smooth tangents and smooth out any UV seams. All right, we'll go ahead and pretty much max most of these out. And you can see how that will go in and blend through a lot of these. We can also choose between a few of these different options and see which one is going to give us the least amount of distortion. We also have a few of these different modes that we can choose from as well. So it's really just going to be a matter of picking and choosing the ones that are going to work best for you. And you can get a pretty good idea of what this is going to look like by just watching your results. So I think for the most part everything on here is going to be set pretty good for me. So once we have this adjusted in the Expert Pass, we can then come back to this Normal and Cavity Map tab. And a couple things we need to adjust. The samples and the subdivision. The samples will basically control how accurate this normal map is. Usually a sample of 1 or 2 is pretty sufficient. Now finally we have the subdivide, and this will actually control how many subdivisions up from the current subdivisions your normal map is going to be calculated at. So if I were to take a look at the wireframe of this object, you can see that we wind up with a lot of these different squared off areas, and unfortunately if we calculate the normal map at this point, the normal map will have some of these edges where we have the UVs. So to fix that, if we take the actual subdivisions up, that will help smooth out the overall subdivision result, or the normal map result. So usually I try to find myself setting this up around 2 or 3 subdivisions to get a nice result. Alright, so I went ahead and paused this for a little bit while the normal map was generating. So you can see actually this normal map does a really good job of being able to pull out a lot of that detail without having to use any sort of displacement maps. What we're viewing right now is actually the low-res mesh just with the normal map overlaid on top of it. And you can see how it really does a good job of being able to pull out that detail. So once you're finished and once you have your normal map generated, what you can do is now just press the escape key on your keyboard, and it's going to look like this image is a little bit wonky, but that is completely normal. It just automatically flipped it for us when we were leaving the ZMapper, right? Because we had chosen that Maya export option. So it went ahead and automatically flipped it. So now this normal map is ready to be exported just like before. So we'll go up to Texture, Export. Alright, and we'll call this Rhino Normal. We'll use the same bitmap. And as I mentioned, it's always a good idea to go ahead and actually type in the extension so that way Zbrush knows exactly what you want to save it at. Alright, now before we go ahead and wrap up this lesson, let's quickly export the displacement map as well. So this one we don't necessarily need to have a texture that's applied to this object. One thing that we do need to take into account is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this training kit, whenever generating the displacement map, you have the option of either exporting this piece of geometry back to your 3D application for displacement mapping, or if you are in a situation where you are not able to export this and maybe somebody else in the office or somebody else in the pipeline is already rigging the character that you had brought in initially, what you're going to have to do is export the displacement maps that match that character's topology. And that's why we saved the morph target at the beginning of this training kit. So you can see the difference in these meshes. If I switch the morph target on or off, you can see how the topology has changed just a little bit. The UVs haven't really changed so much, so it really doesn't affect the color map and the normal map quite so much, but it does affect the displacement map because it needs to be able to know where the geometry is in order to calculate correctly. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and leave the morph target turned off. We'll go ahead and just export this geometry back to our 3D application. But if you're in a situation where you can't export this geometry, just switch on your morph target and then export your displacement maps just like this. Okay, so to export the actual displacement map, a couple of things that are helpful to do. Zbrush 3.1 comes with its own built-in displacement exporter. So that can be found underneath the Z plugins inside Multi-Displacement 3. So if we go ahead and dock this over to the side, you can see we'll have a few options in here. We have things for the overall map size. So we can go anywhere from 2048 all the way up or down the spectrum. So 4096 so that it matches up with everything else. We also have inside the export options the ability to have 32-bit displacement maps, 16-bit displacement maps, and so on and so forth. Right, now most applications will give you the option to use a 32-bit displacement map. You also have the ability to use a 16-bit displacement map, which will work in pretty much any 3D application. So for this particular example, we'll export a 16-bit displacement map. So we also have the ability to control a lot of these things as far as how many channels it's going to have, 1 or 3. Most 3D applications will have a little bit of trouble reading a single channel TIFF displacement map, or basically a grayscale. So typically I find it to be a good idea to go ahead and make it a 3-channel. We do want to flip this vertically, so we can turn any of these options on or off. For channels 1, 2, and 3, I like to have all of these set to a full range. So we can swap through these till we have a full range. I want to go ahead and smooth the UVs on this, so that way we wind up with a nice smooth displacement map. And seamless, this one's really up to you if you want to leave that on or off. Either way, it'll technically wind up seamless. So once we have all these options turned on, we can go ahead and close this. One thing that's sometimes a little bit quirky is whenever you look inside the export options, we do have this option turned on for smooth. Now there's some situations where that smooth may not always take effect until you go all the way down toward the bottom and also turn on smooth down here inside ZBrush's built-in normal displacement exporter. So I'll go ahead and make it a habit of turning that on. Once that's on, and make sure it's also turned on here inside the displacement exporter. Everything's set. So let's go ahead and create this. It's going to ask us where we want to be able to put this and what we want to name it. We can call this Rhino Displace. And go ahead and generate that. Alright, so that'll take just a minute to export, and once that's done, now we're ready to take the normal map, the color map, and the displacement map back into our primary 3D application. So here in just a couple of lessons, we're going to go ahead and do that. Before we move on to that, though, what I want to do before we actually leave ZBrush is take a very quick overview at some of the methods that we have as far as actually using photographic references and photographic elements for these textures, rather than taking the hand painting approach that we've dedicated to most of this training kit. So we'll take a look at that particular method in the next lesson.